All right, All Saints and All Saintsers Online, we are at 9:00 and we are going to start. We have a lot to pack in this forum this morning, and then we have to get to church. So we're going to move right along. I am Susan Russell, one of the clergy on staff here. My pronouns are she, her, and it is my utter delight to be your host for this morning's forum. Which is part of our Women's History Weekend celebration, which is a bigger part of our wider All Saints Centennial, as we celebrate 100 years of not ministry, the congregation is older than that, but of work and witness from this particular corner on Euclid Avenue in Pasadena in this sacred space. So excited about the work ahead of us as we focus on our sisters from the Philadelphia 11 is the focus of our conversation today. I'm going to do a very fast update for anyone who's not familiar with the story. We're going to watch just a moment and sound techs allowing a brief trailer of the film many of us saw yesterday here at All Saints as an introduction, and then we're going to keep moving. So I hope, and then we have a wonderful panel with a conversation to follow. So without further ado, everyone, breathe a little prayer. Let's pray to St. Patrick. What the heck? It'd be a good one to pray today. And let's see how this works.
My mother said to me that I had told her when I was a little girl that I wanted to be a priest. She and my dad both said, well, that's wonderful, honey, but that's just not what girls do.
A heated debate has been going on in the Episcopal Church on whether women can serve as priests.
There's no reason why a woman couldn't be president or a judge or a number of other things. But the one thing that she absolutely cannot be is a mom.
I get so tired of being decided about behind my back.
The oppressor cannot be the instrument of the liberation of the oppressed. And yet in this structure, women do not have the power to effect their own liberation.
Conservative and liberal and progressive and radical and right on the edge. We were not the same by any means.
The phones were ringing off the hook. One woman said, "Are you people going to ordain women there today?" And I said, "Yes, we are." And she said, "You're going to split this church right in half." I said, "The church is already split in half. That's why we're doing it."
Proceedings here enacted are unlawful and schismatical.
It is simply a role which a woman cannot fill.
God shall be called Father, and so shall his priests.
There were all these lights, NBC, ABC, CBS, were out there with their big cameras, and it was like, my goodness.
It was so clear that we were being called to that day, and we were willing to stand, and we would not be denied this.
The Episcopal House of Bishops today ruled invalid last month's ordination of 11 women as priests.
We kept going to parishes that want us there as priests. Of course, we're called a bunch of man-hating dykes, bitches and shrews and all of this stuff. At some point, what was going to happen to us, of course, was a big question.
The 11 little priestesses all in a row, like the little Indians. I'd be delighted if they'd go away.
I suggest to you that we cannot wait to settle questions of the freedom of all of humanity. Women are either free in our society or they are not.
There's a saying, you need to speak the truth even if your voice shakes. And that's what I did.
So while Mr. Video is making his way to the podium to cue up our second video, I want to thank you again. This was a video we screened yesterday. We'll have a chance to see it again at some point in the future, but excited to have been part of telling this story. But the story isn't just about 11 women who wanted to be ordained in the Episcopal Church. The story is so much bigger than that. And the story connects to the All Saints story. And that's part of what we're here to talk about today. The trailer we just heard, that voiceover you heard, where a voice, strong, powerful voice said, "We cannot wait to decide the full humanity of women." That was George Regas, a rector of All Saints Church in 1974. So yeah, give it up for George. And now, due to the marvels of modern technology and our amazing Mr. Audiovisual Everything, Keith, Director of Communications, we're now going to see another video snippet from the All Saints archives and some more recently compiled footage. Some of the voices from All Saints about our story from 1974 connects to what's happening now in 2024, which is going to be the point of our panel. So, Keith? As we observe Women's History Month during this centennial celebration year at All Saints Church, we're also celebrating the upcoming 50th anniversary of the Philadelphia 11, who shattered a stained glass ceiling with their ordinations as the first women priests in the Episcopal Church. Here are a few stories reflecting on where the All Saints story connects to the Philadelphia 11 story, as we continue to become more fully the beloved community God is calling us to be.
The annual weekend, so-called silent retreats, especially the one at St. Mary's in Santa Barbara, where the third woman priest we hired, Susan Buell, was our speaker and celebrated the Eucharist at the end of the weekend on the veranda of the retreat center. And my confrontation afterwards with a very tearful Sister Donna Marie, who said we had desecrated the grounds of their retreat center by having a woman priest celebrate the Holy Mysteries, as they are under the auspices of the Diocese of Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, and do not believe in women's ordination.
Well, I come from a non-religious family. They weren't hostile to religion, but it played no part in their lives. However, I was always a religious child. I don't know quite how that came to be. Obviously the Holy Spirit, I suppose. But when I was 8, I asked my mother if I was baptized, and she said no, and we don't believe in that. And I said, oh, but I do. So being a very lenient parent, a very giving parent, she took me to the local Protestant church, which was an Anabaptist church. They would not baptize me until I was at least 10. Very disappointing. When I was about 13, we lived in Woodland Hills, and I used to sneak into St. Mel's Roman Catholic Church and observe the Mass. It was wonderful. I had no idea what was going on, but I knew it was holy. So I mentioned that eventually to my parents, who were, I think, terrified that I would become a Roman Catholic. I'm not quite sure why, but I suppose if you're non-religious, anyway. They had some friends who were Episcopalians, and I think they decided the Episcopal Church would probably be less dangerous. And so I started going to St. Martin's in Canoga Park. I was baptized and confirmed there about age 15, I think. And the first time I went to St. Martin's, participated in or observed the Eucharist, I thought I died and gone to heaven. Take, eat. And again, I wasn't sure what was happening, but I knew it was holy, and I knew I wanted to be a part of it. And I think what drew me to the church, to Christ, to God, was in fact the Eucharist. I'm still overwhelmed by the Eucharist. I thought when I graduated from seminary I'd understand it completely. I didn't, and I still don't. As a matter of fact, I think I understand it less but appreciate it more. It's the most holy experience. And I think that take, eat, I think made it clear to me my calling was to feed people. I've always been a parish priest. It's all I think I ever wanted to be. I sort of joke that I think as a little boy who played baseball and loved baseball, to be hired by the major leagues and somebody to pay you to play baseball is like my being a priest. Oh my God, they pay me too? It was overwhelming. It was wonderful. I think there are a variety of ways to be called, but I was told that the invitation to my ordination, that the verbiage needed to be God willing and the people consenting. And I felt that very much during the whole process, God willing and the people consenting. I was very moved by the Commission on Ministry, its ministry, and feeling their desire to feel my calling and yet to affirm it as the church. Here I am, a retired priest of the church. I've been priested for over 40 years, and it deeply moves me.
So one summer, I wrote a letter to All Saints Weekly Bulletin. Do any of you remember we used to get all our news with a weekly bulletin? Yeah. And my letter expressed my grave dissatisfaction with the complete maleness of All Saints, and I made a few suggestions. The Star News picked it up and printed my picture. And I had forgotten all about that when I was looking through some of Mother's things after her death there. She had kept it all. Nothing changed. One day I was driving my daughter Diana home from first grade. She said, "I am going to be a nurse." I said, "You're what?" "A nurse." And some dismay, I said, "Well, you've always planned to be a doctor. Since you were 3 years old, you're going to be a doctor." "I know, but girls don't do that." I could hear, you can imagine my consternation. By that time, I'd been practicing real estate for 4 years. I'd been a psychologist and a school teacher, and had never been able to tolerate the concept of girls' or men's rights, women's rights. So I started pondering where she was picking up that crap. So I figured out she wasn't getting it at her school, because the woman who was the minister of the church and the CEO of that particular church was a very powerful woman. She certainly wasn't getting it at home. She wasn't getting it on television, because she didn't see much television at all, and I watched it with her. So that left the church. And we were coming here, she was in church school and all that. So naturally, I went to see George Regas, knowing his preaching about justice. It was not a pleasant conversation. I encountered a steel-enforced brick wall that said some very unpleasant and very uncomfortable things. So the following Sunday, I took a red and blue pen to church with me, and I marked a hash mark on the liturgy for every word, gender word, that was used in the speaking or the reading or the printed word. And there were 100 marks that first time. 97 male, 3 female, wife, mother, and daughter. I put the liturgy in George's mailbox in the office. I did it that week, the next week, and the following week, and the following week, and the following week, and the following week. That went on for some time, until George's basic drive toward justice prompted him to call me. And we set up a diocesan task force to examine the role of women in the church. We decided it was time to change the church and have women priests, by God. We worked hard on it throughout the diocese and brought it up for a vote at the diocesan convention, and it was defeated. So we went back to work, and at the next diocesan convention, it was passed, causing some churches, of course, to leave the diocese. George, by this time, had become a warrior for women, as you all know. He co-chaired the drive for women in the priesthood, took it to national, and there it passed, and it has truly changed and blessed all saints and our whole national church, as we know.
Okay, this is such a great story. As a seminarian, the bishop Bishop Rusak invited us to his home for a swim party. God forbid I be in a bathing suit, but I did go out and buy a new snappy outfit. It was a beautiful silk blouse. Oh, it was so pretty. And linen pants. The top was brown, kind of a cocoa brown, and the pants were white. When we knocked on the door, my husband and I, the bishop opened the door and said, he looks like the seminarian. Thank you, Bishop. So then we went out and we were around a table and talking and sharing. And someone said to me, "You are so gutsy." I said, what are you referring to? And he said, "Well, you're wearing pants." I said, "Well, yes. Don't you know the bishop hates pants?" Oh, I thought I was going to die. It was just terrible. That person who asked me that actually became a bishop. It's interesting. But I was always a little self-conscious after that, and didn't realize that I had this terrible social faux pas.
And our All Saints delegation met to discuss the resolutions. Of course, all the resolutions were in male language. At that time in our history, if one ever spoke up for women, you were jeered. Women were the continual butt of jokes. And it was accepted that if you ever mentioned women, you were the source for humor. Often I could see the smirk behind, well, here goes Margaret again. I questioned one of the resolutions and suggested that we could change the language so that it did not eliminate women. From the group, I received that same treatment. When we were at the convention, which was being held in the downtown Biltmore Hotel, that particular resolution with the offensive language was brought up for a vote. Not knowing any better, I rose, went down the steps to the mic, and I said, "Bishop, I hereby move that we change the language in this resolution to be inclusive and not to exclude women." As I went back to my seat, I could see the amused glint in George's eye. The bishop and Bill Rodiger, who was his lawyer, conferred and conferred and conferred and conferred, and soon Bill rose and he went to the mic and he said, "Mrs. Seidenquist, the rules will not allow us to change the resolution on the floor. However, next year I will change the language. Will that satisfy you?" I went back down the steps to the mic and said, "Mr. Rodiger, I don't seek satisfaction from you, only justice," and then returned to my seat. That sort of brought down the house. So the bishop ordered a short recess. I went to the restroom during the recess, and when I came out, there was a long line of women who reached out to touch me, because this was the first time that anyone had ever spoken up for women at a diocesan convention.
I was a student at the Episcopal Divinity School in 1974 when the Philadelphia ordinations happened in the summer between my first and second years there. And right after those ordinations, two of the Philadelphia 11, Carter Hayward and Sue Hyatt, came to join the EDS faculty. And so I got to know both of them very well, especially Sue, to whom I was very close. EDS was the Episcopal Divinity School in Cambridge, was the first Episcopal seminary to admit women students to the MDiv program. And because we were the kind of epicenter of the ordination of women movement in the church, we had almost 50% of the students were women there. And so that was 74. I graduated in 1976. And as I approached my graduation and ordination to the diaconate dates, I suddenly said to myself, I can't go and get some cushy job someplace and get ordained to the priesthood while my sisters are not able to get ordained and not able to get jobs because nobody wants to hire a deacon. Every priest wants a priest so they can do the 7 o'clock service and the rector won't have to do it. So I preached a sermon in the spring of my senior year on Jonathan Daniels' Day, calling all my classmates, all my male classmates, to do what I did, and that is to say they wouldn't get ordained to the priesthood till women could. Unsurprisingly, none of them followed me, and the bishop Bishop Rusak, to whom I became very close later, but he was very upset with me. I was supposed to go work at a church in Orange County. They immediately withdrew the job offer. And Rusak said, I won't ordain you because it may be that you'll never become a priest. And so George Regas of All Saints Church, who was chair of the Commission on Ministry, and Doug Vest, who was on the standing committee, who were both All Saints people, went to Bishop Rusak and basically said, you just have to ordain Gary to the diaconate, even though he may never become a priest. And they prevailed. I was ordained a deacon. I ended up working for Bishop Rusak as his chaplain for a year. And ultimately I became ordained to the priesthood. I was ordained with Victoria Hatch, who was the first woman in this diocese. I think the ordination of women, I think the Philadelphia ordinations had enormous impact on the church because they were, in a way, consistent with Bishop Seabury going and getting consecrated, the first bishop in America. It was doing something that wasn't quite kosher, but the church then had to deal with. I don't think we would have had the ordination of women for another 20 years if those women hadn't done that. And I think the ministry of women has been the most transformative thing in my life in the church. If you can go back and look at what the clericus looked like back in the 70s, there's a bunch of men in gray suits, or black suits rather, and now not only is it men and women, but it's LGBT people. It's much more racially and ethnically diverse, much more linguistically diverse. The whole pattern for ordained ministry is much more various than it was then, and I really lay that at the feet of the ordination of women. So ordination of women transformed my life, and I think it's transformed the church, and I'm deeply grateful that All Saints had such a big role in it and in my ministry.
All right, as our panelists make their way to the panel, that's a cue for y'all to move. Let's give it up again for these amazing voices, for the opportunity to hear them. And get rid of this. So I'm going to do a very quick, and we really are on a very tight timeline, tighter than I wish, but, killing the, is that something Sally can do? She's moving. There we go. All right. Give it up for the Reverend Dr. Sally Howard. Woo! All right. So I'm going to do a very quick down and dirty introduction of our panel, and then get right into our Q&A time with them, conversation time. First of all, we have the Reverend Canon Nan Pete, who was the first woman of African descent ordained from this diocese in 1984. She has had a long and vaunted career, not just in the Episcopal Church, but impacting the wider Anglican communion. Most notably in 1988, she was the first ordained woman to speak to the Lambeth Conference of Anglican Bishops, and her speech was widely attributed as having been a hinge point in moving other parts of the global communion forward on women's ordination. So welcome Nan Pete, please. Lynn Jay, who we've heard from already, a canon from this diocese, ordained many years ago. We have too many stories to tell. We could do a whole four. You just do the Lynn and Susan show someday. Maybe we will. And Will has been a giant of justice and a thorn in many of the sides of people who needed thorns over the years in this diocese. Let's give it up for Lynn. Monique Thomas is our own former senior warden, who is in her own way a giant of justice, a prophetic voice, and currently serves as the DEI manager for the Huntington Library. And so she brings her expertise on diversity, equity, and inclusion to this conversation. Welcome, Monique, please. And then finally, the Reverend Dr. Gary Hall, who needs no introduction, however, longtime former All-State staffer, longtime friend, colleague, Bloy House dean, my Anglican polity professor. He taught me everything I ever knew, so it's all your fault. Thank you. And a former dean of the Washington National Cathedral, now theoretically retired, but back with us for this conversation. We're so grateful you were able to join us. All right, now. Our first question.
Could I recommend to my colleagues to turn your mics on? This happened to me last time I was at the forum, and so you have to turn it on yourself. There's a button.
Okay.
There's a button right down here.
All right. The ritual turning on of the mic.
I guess, yeah.
So bearing in mind we have about 40 minutes, 35. Let's start with, what is the single biggest lesson you think we can learn from the story of the 1974 Philadelphia 11 as we work to write our own story of liberation in 2024? There are indeed connections between women and men who were able to organize, mobilize, and unify to clearly dismantle hierarchical and patriarchal systems in 1974 that are or can be transferable to the work ahead of us right now in 2024, which, not to paint with the brush too broadly, is nothing short of how do we address, respond, and dismantle the rising tide of white supremacist, patriarchal, Christofascism in this country. It's a big job. We're the ones who've been called to do it. What can we learn from what happened in 1974 on how we can do that work moving forward in the future? Jump ball, who wants to go first?
I have a pithy answer already worked out in the car. First of all, I want to say how great it is to see Nan Pete again. Nan and I were ordained a little bit apart from each other here in Southern California, and Nan, when I was in DC, Nan and Carol Cole Flanagan and I were in a support group together, and Nan is one of the people that kept me sane in my years in Washington. So, Nan, it's just wonderful to have you back in God's country here in Southern California. Two quick things. As I said, I'm going to repeat slightly what I said in the video, and that is, I was a seminarian at EDS in Cambridge, and that was where all of the strategizing was being done, because Harvey Guthrie, some of you may remember Harvey, who used to come here in his retirement. Harvey Guthrie, the dean at the time, was the leader before George of the General Convention strategy. And all of the strategizing about what to do with the ordinations was happening in Cambridge and Philadelphia. And they very consciously looked back to Bishop Seabury, our first bishop, who was elected, went to England to get consecrated. They wouldn't consecrate him because he couldn't take the oath of allegiance to the crown. And so he went to Scotland and got ordained by Scottish bishops. And he was ordained in a way that was considered valid but irregular, okay? Which is exactly what happened with the Philadelphia ordinations. They decided to have these ordinations of 11 women who were all deacons, who had presented themselves for regular ordinations in their own diocese and had been turned down. And these three bishops, and I do want to shout out to the three bishops, Robert DeWitt, Daniel Corrigan, and Edward Wells, because they took some risks in doing this themselves. These three bishops decided to do this ordination and again presented the church with ordinations that were irregular. They hadn't gone through the regular process, but they had to be considered valid, especially by the Anglo-Catholics who were opposing them. So their own theology made them consider them priests, even if they were not valid or irregular priests. So my point is, to me, the great lesson of that moment was when we couldn't do it by the book, we figured out a way to do it and get it done, and then let the book catch up with us.
Amen.
And I think that is what we need to do as the church now. I think we're heading into a time in our history when we will be asked to be the resistance against an authoritarian oligarch in the White House. And I think if that happens, we have to give up our white glove, polite country club Episcopalian habits and really go into the hills and be the resistance. And I think that it's... So you can write me at Gitmo, after January of 2025. But my point is, I think that what happened in Philadelphia showed us the way to do that, and those people displayed enormous courage, and I think it's incumbent on us to do the same.
Amen. Who wants to follow that? Lynn.
I said that yesterday, Gary. We are going to be the resistance, and maybe we are already. We have no choice. Freedom, democracy, the church, and our orders require it. Amen.
I was really inspired by the story. I had never heard of the Philadelphia 11 until last year when Susan was talking about it and promoting it. And it was very inspiring to me as a woman, but also a woman born in 1974. So I was like, wow, all this was happening. It's my anniversary too. But I think what it taught me as I'm watching it, and I have to be honest, and they actually talk about it in the film, all the women were white. And that it was years later when the first Black women of color were ordained. So I think intersectionality is something that I want people to take away from that. The fact that when inequities happen, systemic injustice, that you can't separate the racial piece from the gender piece, right? That there were Black men who were ordained and there were white women, but there were no Black women, right? And so where do we sit in all of that? And we're still grappling with that now. So as we move forward as a church, that's what I want to see is how do we think about intersectionality? How do we think about that in terms of race and gender identity? One of the things that they weren't grappling with, they were, but not sort of outwardly, was gender identity. What is going on with our non-binary and trans siblings as well? How do they fit into all of this? So I think we learned what it means to, one of the priests said yesterday in the film, to speak out even when your voice is shaking. We have to be able to do that and to be strong, but sometimes we have to turn that lens back to ourselves as the church before we're out in the street and fix what we have going on. And there's conversations that we need to have about equity in terms of gender and race.
I don't think that, is this working? Oh, okay. One of the things that the film I took away not one of the things, but that disobedience comes out of obedience. And once you know what you're doing, then you can react against it. But you have to have a conviction before you can act against anything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, one of the thank you. One of the bylines we've used over the years is that we're not being politically correct, we're being gospel obedient. And when that's the litmus test, that will call us into places we hadn't expected to go. And a quick comment on the impact of the women's ordination, and Gary's comments made me think of this. We used actually the same methodology when we were working for first blessings and then marriage and full inclusion of LGBTQ people in the Episcopal Church. Not quite there yet, so much further than we were when we started. But it was by starting to have in places where we could have civil marriage, bringing marriages forward for blessings. So we were no longer it was no longer theoretical, it was ontological. We weren't talking about if these people were married. These people were married, and then what was the church going to do about it? So it's that kind of approach that worked. And I loved also in the film when Pat Merchant brought out that notebook where they had tracked every deputation for every diocese in the church and who their votes were. It's exactly the methodology Gary and I and a number of others used as we were working with Chicago Consultation and others around continuing to build equity for LGBTQ people. So again, the intersectionality of this work is what we learn, I hope, that will carry forward with us. Which brings me to the second question. What obstacles and challenges do we face in our story they did not face in theirs? There are similarities 50 years ago, but the world is vastly different in terms of our communications, the global nature of the work, and what kind of resources or tools do you think we need to overcome them in the work that we have ahead of us? Anybody have any thoughts on that?
Well, the church has certainly become marginalized. We're not the force that we once were. And does that require that we become more radical? Does that require that we become sort of guerrilla warfare in the streets? I don't know, maybe. But we certainly have become marginalized.
When I was in seminary, they still, on Monday morning, the New York Times had a column of things that were said in New York City pulpits on Sunday, which of course no longer obtains. I think Lynn's right. I think we are more marginalized. On the other hand, we're not encumbered by being, that was one of my frustrations in Washington was I felt that the cathedral was the last place in America where people still believed that we were the official church of the United States and its establishment. That's not true anywhere anymore. So we don't have the visibility. We wouldn't get a NBC Nightly News show on us in the same way. But on the other hand, we're not encumbered by all of those establishment burdens and trappings.
We can sneak around and no one knows.
That's right.
No one even notices.
What is interesting, and I live in the D.C. area, and the governor of Texas has sent busloads of immigrants, and they're dropped off in front of the vice president's residence, which is amazing in itself. But what's happened, the Episcopal Church in D.C. has been in the forefront and taking them in and trying to provide resources for them. So I think that's one way that we can regain our role, is to be more active in the issues around immigration and diversity.
But does the New York Times report that the church is participating in that manner?
The Washington Post does occasionally.
I think that's what.
And it
Well,
gets,
they
and
reported
it
the
gets
stuff.
on the news because, when you stop by the White House, I mean, not the White House, but Vice President's house, that draws attention. And St. Thomas Episcopal Church is one of the leading churches in working with the immigrants.
Yeah, I think that's one of both of you, Gary and Nan have both touched on media, right? So when we were watching the film yesterday, they had talked about how ABC, NBC, and CBS were there. That's what I grew up on. And then I think Fox came along when I was like 13. But we only had like 3 networks. Now we have social media. And depending on algorithms, what you want to hear is what you will get. And so as the church, I feel like the communities are overly saturated with information, but we've been diluted a little bit because unless you're looking for Episcopal news, you're not finding it. And we have, I talk to young people all the time, and I'm like, are you looking for a church that is, progressive, and we have a pride flag? And they're like, yeah. How do we reach those folks and let them know we're what they need? And so for me, I think what we struggle with that they didn't have is communication, is social media, is how do we overcome the noise to reach people?
Right. And how do we provide an alternative to the rabid rhetoric of the religious right, for lack of a better word, who are proclaiming that they hold sole possession of Christian values? I mean, we have values aligned with that radical rabbi from Nazareth that have literally nothing to do with the justice, condemnation, and hatred being proposed by, again, this rising tide of Christian nationalism, who, in my perspective, are hijacking the gospel as a weapon of mass destruction, aimed not just at our democracy, but at anyone on the margins. And so if there is not gospel work to be, if that isn't gospel work, I don't know what it is. And this is, again, part of that work that we're called to do, not just here at All Saints, but as part of the wider church. All right, closing question. We have 5 minutes left. Trying to end on a slightly hopeful note. Lynn J., I'm talking to you. Try and find something hopeful, honey. A reprise of a question we asked on Saturday. What story do you hope the church is telling 50 years from now at our next centennial? Or 100 years from now at our next centennial? Again, we're celebrating 100 years on this corner, assuming we haven't killed the planet and they're still letting us tell a story. What story would you hope is being told 100 years from now by those who might be sitting on a podium like this?
I would hope that we have shown that the religious right was wrong.
Well, I preface this by saying I love this place. I actually started coming to this place right after I got out of college, before I went to seminary. And one of the reasons I chose the seminary I did was because George Rodriguez and Bill Rankin had gone to ETS. And they were both my heroes. I hope that 100 years from now, All Saints will finally have outgrown its unconscious white male straight privilege.
Amen.
I still think this place is a product of the entitled culture that built it. And every rector I've known in this church has had to find a way to try to lead us into a new place. I still think there are vestiges of that entitled white, straight, male, cisgender privilege as part of the culture here. I hope 100 years from now we've really become egalitarian and inclusive.
Amen. This is not my poker face.
Ditto to what Gary said.
Yeah,
No,
Monique.
and I think also just really for people to find that this is a place where they can throw away that toxic theology, come into a place where we really, when we say whoever you are and wherever you are on your journey, there is a place for you. And that's reflected in the pulpit that we see all types of people. And that it's not, with diversity, equity, inclusion, it's not just about diversity, not just seeing different faces and ages, but do they feel included and welcome, radically welcomed and celebrated? That's what I want to see, where people aren't just, well, we're going to let you in. But do you feel welcomed and celebrated? That's what I want to see in 100 years.
Thank you, all of you. Thank you. We are almost at time. It's impossible to cover, but I hope this will be part of an ongoing conversation we can have throughout the rest of this centennial year. If you have thoughts or ideas for how you'd like to continue that conversation, please let me know. Again, Susan Russell, S. Russell at allsaints-pass.org. Google me. I'm almost impossible not to find online. I'd love to have further further conversation. I think there's a lot of work we can do together as we continue both to celebrate and challenge each other. One of the taglines for this centennial year is engaging our past as we imagine our future. And I want to end with a quote from one of my mentors, Frederica Harris Thompson, who is a historian and fierce woman of faith. And she said, the reason we learn our history is to get a running start on our future. The future right now is too critical, too perilous, and too scary for us not to get whatever running start we can get. So that's part of what we're doing here today in this forum. It's part of what we're going to do in 15 minutes when we gather in church for an extraordinary opportunity to gather around the table again, to ask God to be present with us, to hear a word from Sister Nan, to have Lynn preside and celebrate for us, to ask God to bless that bread and wine, make it holy, and send us out into the world as beacons of God's love, justice, and compassion. That's the work we're about every time we gather at All Saints Church. It's a privilege to do it, grateful to be able to do it today. And with that, here endeth the forum. Thank you all. I'll see you in the church.